Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. Tonight, I'm here with my friend, Dee Pierce, the host of Around the World with Dee and Friends. And what we're going to do tonight is we're going to do analysis and commentary uh, on a rather long video, a panel discussion. But that was run by the Schiller Institute, and that featured Scott Ritter, uh, Ray McGovern, uh, a professor called Steve Starr, uh, Larry Johnson. Uh, it was a very powerful video in terms of discussion of the Russian response to the decision by the United States to allow the Ukrainians to use ATACMS and Storm Shadows and Scalps by firing them in to Russia proper. That was a new development, okay, in the war. I went over that in my last stream. But of course, what's been going on is still open to debate and reconstruction. And this particular panel study was about the most powerful thing that I'd seen on it. So I wanted to bring you the analysis and commentary that we're going to bring you. So
We're happy to be here, Joe.
Okay, thank you, Dee. And thank you for sharing.
And this way we can get the audience to grow, let people know you're live.
Yeah.
Joe's here. Joe's in the house.
Yes, I am in the house. I think before I share the screen, I'll share on Facebook also. I frequently forget to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I know most of the people who follow me follow Dee also.
Yes.
He's already shared that, so it's probably a bit redundant that I share it, but nevertheless, I think I'm going to do that just in case there are a few people who Dee misses with her shares. Okay, so with that done, I'm going to share the screen for the video that we'll be tearing apart in one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to start it at 13 minutes and 30 seconds in. There's an introductory piece by somebody by the name of Dennis Speed, I think.
Okay.
I didn't think that his contribution was something that we had to watch. What we're starting off with now is the start of Scott Ritter's contribution. He made two distinct contributions, and both were very, very important. So this is his first contribution.
Ritter, who has just joined us on the line here. I'd like to go to Scott Ritter next, who's a former UN weapons inspector and has been an incredible voice for true peace.
I should add that particular lady, Kay, is Anastasia Battle, and she's the moderator of the discussions at the Schiller Institute. Okay, she's a very, very nice moderator, very gentle.
Do we have you there, Scott?
I'm here.
There we go. Please go ahead.
Oh, okay. I didn't know.
I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, I came on today, one, because I believe understand what this panel is doing, but more importantly, I need to appeal to this panel to help us save your lives, my life, and everybody's life. We are closer today than we have ever been, ever, in the history of the nuclear era. Since nuclear weapons were used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we are closer today than ever for nuclear weapons being used again. We are literally at the threshold of a nuclear war. Now, this isn't hyperbole. I'm not here to scare you. I don't give a damn what you think. You're going to die unless we do something to stop it. This is on full frickin' automatic. Russia has lowered its threshold for the use of nuclear weapons, including conditions that knows that NATO and the United States have already met. If Russia assiduously adhered to its nuclear doctrine, they would be able to use nuclear weapons today against NATO. They have opted not to, but we have already passed that threshold. At the same time, we have a Rear Admiral Buchanan in the United States Strategic Command who speaks glibly about the America ready to have a nuclear exchange with the Russians. Do you know what that means, a nuclear exchange? It means a nuclear war. We're ready to have one. Russia has lowered its nuclear threshold, and America is ready to engage in a nuclear exchange with Russia.
Okay, so Scott starts off by saying he doesn't mean to scare us. Okay, and then, of course, he proceeds to scare us. Okay, this is not necessarily a criticism because I share his view that at this point, as a collective, as a people, we need to be scared. It's right to be scared because we are far too close to a nuclear war, which would mean, well, there are various estimates, but you'll hear those from him. So, D, anything to add?
I have to say that the media, for the most part, is really not talking about this. The seriousness. This is serious.
Yes, and okay, I think that's really amazing that they're not actually talking about it. They're so used to ignoring developments and not seeing the full implications of them or not wanting to talk about them that they're not drawing the obvious conclusion as to what the significance is between the recent exchange between ourselves, and the Russians.
As we speak, right here, any moment. Right now, the United States and Europe are trying to figure out what to do after Russia responded to their foolish decision to allow Ukraine to use ATACMS missiles and Storm Shadows missiles to strike Russia. Russia has responded with a unique missile system, an intermediate range system, which we know very little about. But what we do know, or what we can speculate based upon past practice and what's going on, is this missile is special purpose built to take out targets of concern in NATO deployed in Europe. I believe this missile was developed on the orders of President Putin sometime this last summer to destroy the Dark Eagle missile complex that the United States is. It's a hypersonic intermediate range missile that the United States is planning on deploying.
Eine
I believe
Hyperschallrakete Rakete.
developed to
Excuse me,
destroy
the German interpretation is in the wrong channel. Please continue, Scott. Sorry.
I apologize to all the Germans. The Mark 41, uh, Aegis Ashore air defense system that was ostensibly built to deal with Iran, but we all know it was built to deal with Russia. And today, NATO views it as a mainstay in their air defense against Russia. This system is designed to take that out. It's designed to take out command and control facilities, logistic facilities from top to bottom, left to right, all of Europe, using non-nuclear payloads. But nonetheless, this would be a Russian strike against NATO. What Russia has demonstrated is that it is ready right now, as we speak, to strike any target in Europe if Europe gives them an excuse to do so. How will Europe respond? Article 5, according to Joe.
Okay, so I want to comment, okay, at this point. The Dark Eagle system that he referred to, that we are talking about putting into Europe, would be an intermediate range system that was hypersonic, in character. Now, we haven't started producing any hypersonic missiles yet, but by next year, they're supposed to be ready. Okay, and we have been making preparations for installing them in Europe. And the system we're trying to build in Germany to accommodate, these new missiles is known as the Dark Eagle system. So one thing that's happened is by introducing these new missiles, what the Russians are doing is they are already introducing and also producing their counter to the Dark Eagle system. In other words, their deterrent counter is appearing a full year or two before the Dark Eagle is going to appear.
Mm.
I think that's very significant. Okay, the Russians are so far ahead of us that countering us before we make our move. Okay, now to talk about the significance of the missile also, as an IRBM, of course, until 2019, there was an intermediate missile treaty in place. And Scott had worked on the development of that particular treaty, which was in place, I believe, since the 1990s, maybe even before, since the 1980s. Okay, I forget. That the treaty was an answer to the earlier situation where the Russians, and the Americans were facing each other, in Europe, where we were about to introduce the Pershing II systems in Europe, which were fast enough to get to Moscow, in just a few minutes. And the Russians, had their own systems that were just as fast. So it was a mutual deterrence type of system. And there was really a great amount of danger in them because of the potential for accidents or for, rogue people getting involved. Those systems, the early systems, were capable of, of carrying nuclear warheads. And so they were very dangerous. So Reagan and Gorbachev wanted to tone down the tensions.
Mhm.
So they concluded this treaty in the middle of the 1980s. And Scott actually worked on that treaty and did a lot of good work in connection with it as an inspector. Okay, and that treaty virtually removed the risk of a nuclear war for nearly 40 years. Then in 2019, during the third year of the Trump administration, uh, Trump was prevailed upon by the neocons in his administration to drop out of the treaty because the neocons knew about the development, some R&D work that had been done on intermediate range missiles, specifically the missiles that were now going to be a part of the Dark Eagle system. So the neocons wanted to use the IRBMs, and they got Trump to drop the treaty. That was just about the last of the arms control treaties, that were in place. Number of arms control treaties, were negotiated, but during the 1980s and the early 90s, and they were making us safe. But the neocons could not stand prosperity. And starting in the Bush II administration, I guess even starting in the Clinton administration, the United States started to pull out of the treaties. And the last one they pulled out of was the most dangerous one to pull out of, and that was done by Trump in 2019. Now, since 2019, what the Russians did is they acted as if they still had that treaty in place because they recognized that to begin to build the IRBMs themselves would be extremely provocative and would introduce extreme risk
Mhm.
into the new situation. And they determined that unless the United States itself was starting to threaten them with such a system, that they were not going to develop one of their own. Well, of course, in terms of developments like the Dark Eagle, the Russians decided, well, we're going to have a counter, to the Dark Eagle. And this system is both something that gives them a tremendous advantage in terms of the Vietnam War and gives them something they can do without having to go to a nuclear war, immediately.
Mhm.
And it gives them something to use with a devastating effect in the final days of this war. And it gives them a deterrent against, the United States and NATO going further, gives them deterrence against NATO and the United States continuing to contemplate the idea of going into Ukraine to save the regime there and prolong the war. So that's why Putin has done this. And the first reaction to it, in Europe has been pretty chaotic. In other words, they understand the significance of this new missile system. Okay, anything to add at this point, Dee?
as I have to say is it's a wake-up call, and they thought they were so superior, the hegemony,
Yes,
and the world we're seeing is waking up. They've got to protect themselves. Everybody's got to protect themselves.
yes, everybody's got, has to protect themselves. I have to add one thing at this point also. Okay, though the Russians attacked with conventional warheads on this, and Scott is going to get into the technical aspects of this, but as we go through the panel. But one technical aspect, okay, that's important is that these missiles can carry either conventional warheads or uh, uh, nuclear warheads. Now, the first versions are using only conventional warheads, but the Russians can escalate, and that's important because you cannot easily tell when they've escalated, when they've changed from conventional warheads, to nuclear warheads.
Hmm.
That can be detected, but it's a little difficult. Okay, going on.
By this is a sacred obligation. Many NATO nations have been leaning forward, waiting for an opportunity for Article 5 because they believed Russia was bluffing, but Russia isn't bluffing. Russia just proved it's not bluffing. And now, how does NATO respond to this? Back down, retreat? Too
Hmm.
much political capital has been invested.
Well, there's probably an ad coming up.
This Russia's not bluffing. And if we continue to call his bluff, call Putin's bluff, call Russia's bluff, there will be a nuclear war. And I'm very concerned that because we are in a very compressed timeline, we have the Biden administration, together with their NATO allies, admitting that they're seeking to Trump-proof NATO, Trump-proof
Hmm.
Ukraine, Trump-proof this policy of the strategic defeat of Russia, so that by the time Donald Trump is sworn in as president on January 20th, he will not be able to change any of this. That means that there's a compressed timeline between now and January 20th to get all of this in place, and they can't afford delays. They can't afford pauses. They can't afford doubt. And my concern is they are going to aggressively move forward, forcing Russia's hand. And then we're going to have Admiral Buchanan's little nuclear exchange. But there's no such thing as a little nuclear exchange. There's no such thing as limited nuclear war. Once the nuclear weapons start flying, read Annie
Hmm.
Jacobson's book, Nuclear War Scenario. It quickly spins out of control. 72 minutes after the first nuclear device explodes, we are all dead. That's where we're at. Now, what are we going to do about it? I mean, we can have conferences, etc. I think we only have one chance at
Hmm.
stopping this nuclear war, and that is to get the president elect to become actively engaged in calling out the Biden administration and speaking to the American people. Regardless of where you stand on the election that took place on November 5th, there was a winner. And that winner is Donald Trump. And Donald Trump has articulated a policy that seeks to end the conflict in Ukraine and prevent a nuclear war in Russia. If you don't believe me, refer to the article published on The Hill magazine, authored by RFK Jr. and Don Trump Jr., two people who are on the inside of the Trump team. They wouldn't have published this article without the permission and concurrence of Donald Trump. We know this is Trump's position. The American people endorsed this position when they gave him the mandate to govern. And yet now the Biden administration is operating in a way that directly contravenes this seeks to disrupt this, seeks to make it impossible, and in doing so pushes us to the brink of a nuclear Armageddon. How can we get him involved? How we can make our voices heard? The old-fashioned way. Shout it out from the top of our voices in Washington, D.C. And what I'm asking is that everybody join me in Washington, D.C. on December 7th. I've reached out to Jose Vega. I've reached out to others. Jose has reached out. We're beginning to put together a team that's going to make this possible. December 7th, 2 weeks, we can save the world, save our life, save your life by making our voices heard. If we make it to that, there's no guarantee. There's no guarantee that we're going to make it to December 7th. And I'm not being facetious. One stupid error and it's all over. The war begins and we all die. But just in case we do make it past Thanksgiving, in case we do enjoy that turkey dinner, we can gather in Washington, D.C. at the Lincoln Memorial and then march to Congress and then march to the White House and make our voices heard that we are going to say no to nuclear war. That's a hashtag that I want everybody to start trending. Hashtag say no to nuclear war. Get on social media and make this happen. This is it. I don't know what else you're going to do because you're going to die if you don't do this. If we don't find a way to make our voices heard, to let the Biden administration know that this is not acceptable. This is not how we do business. This is not what we, the people, want. That they will continue to pursue these policies to the detriment of everybody. And that's really all I wanted to say is keep an eye on the space as we develop this mission. This is the mission of a lifetime. This is the battle of our lives. If we lose this, we all die. Literally, we all will die. We are so close to nuclear conflict, it's not funny. When you have a senior officer in Strategic Command saying openly that we are ready to engage in a nuclear exchange with Russia, do you understand what he is saying? Do you understand that a nuclear exchange means hundreds of millions of dead people? 100 million dead Americans, minimum. And they're ready to do it right now. If you're not angry, if you're not scared, you're not human. They are ready to go to nuclear war right now. We need to stop it. And coming together on December 7th just might give us a chance. Thank you very much for letting me come here and speak, and that's what I have to say.
Okay, so a couple of comments on that, on context. One contextual comment is when we try to look at the motivation of the Biden administration to accelerate things. In other words, to pack a bunch of accelerating actions into the 60 days that are left. What's the motivation of the Biden administration for trying to do that? Well, one motivation is their perceptions of Trump and what he wants to do. He has given plenty of indication that he is not friendly to NATO. In other words, that first of all, he thinks the expenditures on NATO are completely out of balance, that the Europeans are not pulling their weight when it comes to paying for things. He's indicated that and made a number of unfriendly comments. Okay, he's also indicated that, he's not sure how necessary NATO is these days. So basically, he's indicated that in his second term, he may actually decide to pull out of NATO and end the alliance. Now, this kind of thinking is greatly alarming to the establishment foreign policy people in both parties. Okay, but the Democratic Party and the administration that is still in office, in particular, Biden's whole life in foreign policy, since he got on the Senate committee, a key dimension of his thinking about foreign policy has been that we're part of the NATO alliance. We're the mainstay, the NATO alliance. It's the foundation of our influence in Europe. It's our tool, for opposing first the Soviets and now the Russians. He's lived his whole life thinking that NATO is essential to his foreign policy concerns. And that's true for the rest of the foreign policy establishment in his administration, but it's also been true for the foreign policy establishment in the Republican administration largely as well. So you have all these people who are totally wedded to NATO, who cannot think of a future without NATO. And here's Trump coming in again, and one of the more objectionable things that he might be inclined to do is to either bring very, very large changes to NATO or to completely eliminate NATO. I think that is a strong motivation for people inside of the Biden administration to try to tie Trump's hands, to get him more deeply involved in a NATO war that he's not able to get out of because it's too complicated, to get out of it. And that's why I think they're trying to accelerate the situation. They're trying to hang on, in Ukraine. The Russians are getting close to completely collapsing the government there. And if it completely collapses, it will be very hard to continue, the war there. There are other motivations also. When we get to Larry Johnson's comments, he also has some good insights as to why the administration is so keen on staying inside of Ukraine and continuing those efforts. But I don't know how important that is to Biden and the foreign policy clique that he's appointed. For them, I think the more important motive is, it's NATO. We just can't do without NATO. We've never done without NATO. It's just completely evil to try to get out of NATO. And I think they're deathly afraid that Trump, is going to try to get us out of it. Now, from my point of view, it might be a very good thing for Trump to do to get us out of NATO. And, I'll bring that up later. But from Biden's point of view, it's just an unthinkable thing. And if he does think about, actually negotiating to end this war in the 60 days that he has, he's certainly not going to negotiate in such a way as to end, the NATO alliance. That's beyond his thinking. Any comments, Dee?
What I was going to say, a lot of foreign policy experts, well, people we call policy experts, for a long time now have been saying that we're past the days of NATO. And it would be a good thing to move on and move on to the future. We've got to get out of this way of thinking. It's an old way of thinking.
Yes, it's an old way of thinking, but from the standpoint of the establishment Democrats,
They don't know anything else.
yeah, they don't know anything else and they don't want to know anything else.
No.
And their mindset is such that they can't even think of anything else. It's important here to recognize that Trump can think of something else. And that's a big difference between he and Biden. So let's go forward with, okay, so Scott has basically laid out his thinking and has proposed to us a major demonstration in Washington, okay, on March 7th. And, he's going to say more about that later. But now we're going to hear from from Ray McGovern, who's going to comment on the proposal Scott has made.
Thank you, Scott. And yes, we are pulling that team together. And I just want to say that there's going to be a number of other initiatives that are being put forward. I think what you're putting out about the social media is very important. We have some other people who have some ideas on that as well. So that'll come up during the discussion. But we'll continue with our agenda so we can have that discussion. But I want to thank you again for joining us, Scott, and putting this forward. Next, we have Ray McGovern, who is a former CIA analyst and co-founder of Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. Thank you so much for joining us, Ray. Do we have?
Okay, so here, I wanted to say, Anastasia told us here that the Schiller Institute is going to be joining Scott, in this effort, and also running events to supplement what's going on in the street demonstration. They're going to support it with social media efforts, but as you'll hear, as we go forward in the panel, they're also going to have a supplementary event, a 2-day conference on December 7th, and December 8th, in order to educate people about, the issues involved here. So that's important also. It's not simply Scott alone. He's got a number of people who will be joining him. Jose Vega, who we know is an organizer, is going to help him with the organization. And Jose has got some organizational resources in the New York area. Okay, that will certainly help to, get this going on.
Have you on there? There we go. Hi, welcome. Good to have
Thank
you
you.
on.
And I want to thank Scott for being persistent in warning us of the imminent dangers. They are truly unique in the history of our nation, in the history of the nuclear era. It is. Can everyone hear me? I see some people. Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
we can hear you.
Okay. It's hard to think of some good news at this point. But you know what? We all need to stay sane. And even though it's on a related subject, not Ukraine, we just learned that the president of Ireland, that the head of Ireland, the Taoiseach, has said that if Netanyahu lands in Shannon, he will be arrested and given over to the World Court. That's good news. Okay, maybe people will follow his example, because under the procedure of universal jurisdiction, those who signed the Rome Treaty are obligated to act in that way. Now that's reaching pretty far for some good news, but it is good news, and we need to grasp on to whatever news comes that way. I would add simply that the Irish know what forced starvation is. They know what the great hunger is. And I think we should take Taoiseach at his word. And if Netanyahu wants to fly here, where we won't arrest him, and he runs out of fuel over Ireland, he's not going to be able to ditch Shannon. He's going to have to go somewhere else. Now, it was also mentioned that John Kennedy, it's the anniversary of his death. It's been 61 years. Okay. Why do I mention that? Well, we know about his speech at American University, and Dennis quoted from it. I would like to quote the operative portion from this in the situation we find ourselves now. And it is this, quote, above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice between a humiliating retreat or actually the use of nuclear weapons. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. That is what Scott and others are warning us about. So, where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with other things that Dennis drew our attention to, and that is, where's Biden? Is he sane? Who's making the decisions? Now, we know from the Defense Department's spokeswoman that it's very, very doubtful that the Defense Department was informed about this decision to authorize deeper strikes into Russia. Whoa, where does that leave us? That means Blinken, Sullivan are operating this thing. And that's really, really, really dangerous, because they have a cog in the wheel in the form of the head of the CIA director, and his name is Bill Burns. Whatever they tell him, he'll do. He's a cog in the administrative wheel. I'm very disappointed in that. But, given the fact that, last July, he told the president, look, Putin has already lost in Ukraine. His army has been shown to be a laughing stock to the whole world. That's the kind of leadership we have at the CIA. Now, why do I mention that? Very briefly, Scott also mentioned one stupid move. I made a little note of it here. Well, that's all it would take, okay? One stupid move. And then we have the situation that John Kennedy 61 years ago warned us about, a choice between humiliating retreat and the use of nuclear weapons. Why do I?
Okay, why would we take that one stupid move? What is the potential for that particular stupid move, and why is there a potential there? Well, consider again what's happened with the introduction of the new weapon by the Russians. What the Russians have shown with their use of that weapon is that they have conventional means to devastate the cities of Europe. So, if we continue with the ATACMS and the Storm Shadows and the Scalps, and we keep on sending them into Russia, directly attacking Russia, engaging in war, against the Russians. The Russians have a means to reply which could devastate our bases in Europe, anywhere in Europe, from Eastern Europe to the UK, and they can devastate our bases, and they can devastate also NATO cities without using nuclear weapons. Because the conventional warheads, one of these missiles, actually divides as it's going through space. It splits up into 36 packages. In other words, 36 payloads coming out of one missile that can independently target spaces within a particular radius, a certain radius. Since the missile is hypersonic, it can strike the ground with immense force. But by the way, this missile is running it between Mach 10 and Mach 12. So it hits the ground with tremendous force and can destroy any targets. So it can devastate all of our bases in Europe and can devastate also the cities of Europe without having to escalate to nuclear war. But if we want to retaliate, how could we retaliate towards Russia if the escalation got to that point? We don't have a way to retaliate using conventional arms because we don't have any way to counter this missile or to deter the use of this missile except by going nuclear. So we'd be the ones to go nuclear first in this particular situation. We'd be the one faced with the choice, as Scott will soon tell us, faced with the choice of capitulate or go nuclear. So I'll continue. Dee, have you any comment on that?
All I can say is backtrack it and say this is all because of with Trump coming into office.
Yes. It's all because of Trump coming into office and fear of the changes that Trump may introduce into our foreign policy, changes which are intolerable to Joe Biden, to Tony Blinken, and also Jake Sullivan and others in the administration. We know Lloyd Austin, well, I'm sure he's quite opposed to those changes also. His role is still to advise the president on whether we have the capability to do certain things. And a few weeks back in September, he did advise the president not to escalate with ATACMS. And it's obvious that it was his advice that shut down the escalation by the United States at that time. Okay. But after the election, Tony Blinken and Jack Sullivan obviously contrived to keep a discussion about whether to go back to the ATACMS or not away from Lloyd Austin. He was never informed that they were reconsidering a decision made in September. So basically, they went around Lloyd Austin. And they did it when Biden was at the G20 in South America. I think Tony Blinken was there with him in South America or in close touch with him. And he got Biden to change his mind about this. Probably the way he got Biden to change his mind was to talk about how when Trump comes in office, he might get rid of NATO, and that had to be stopped. That's probably how he got Biden to change his particular decision. Okay, anything more, Dee?
No, let's continue.
Okay.
I make this point. Well, because 41 years ago, I was on active duty with the CIA, and so was my good friend Mel Goodman, who was one of the few left that would tell the truth. Long story short, there was an exercise of proportions the Russians had never seen. Okay, it was called Able Archer. It included the president, a vice president, included everybody in Europe, and the Russians thought it was the real thing. We know they thought it was the real thing. We had a double agent in the UK, Gordievsky, who was telling us, look, the KGB is concerned it's the real thing, and they're telling this disabled leadership, which Russia had at the time, that they better be careful. They may expect a nuclear strike. My friend Mel Goodman had the courage to go to his boss. His boss, the analysis director of the CIA, was Robert Gates. Now, Robert Gates has said in his memoir, you know, I never thought it was on the top of my job jar to make the Russians comfortable. I thought it was much better to keep them on a razor edge. Okay, that's the attitude Gates had. So Gates dismissed it when Goodman went to him and said, look, they think it's the real thing. They're getting ready. We have information. They're loading nuclear weapons on aircraft. Please call the White House. Tell them to stop it. Well, Gates said, I'm not going to do that. So, to his great credit, Goodman and two others went around Gates up to Bill Casey. And they said, Mr. Casey, this is really serious. The Russians think we're about to attack it. They're going to attack us. Would you please call the White House? Would you call McFarland, the National Security Advisor? Call the president. Tell him to tone this thing down. Okay. Tell him to get in touch with the Russians. This is not the real thing. Okay. Casey heard them out. I said, thanks very much. They left. Next thing you know, the White House has toned the thing down. It's a narrow escape, folks. You may recall that earlier in 1983, we had the downing of KAL 007. We had the evil empire espoused by Reagan. We had lots of other things where things were almost as delicate, almost as dangerous, almost as they are now. Now, why do I mention that? Well, where is Bill Burns? He's the head of the CIA now. Where are the courageous people? Gates had Goodman had to leave the agency after that because Gates wouldn't abide him. Where are there any left at the CIA to sound the knell? And if they tell Bill Burns, I mean, it boggles the mind to think that Bill Burns would be worse than Bill Casey. Bill Casey was an inveterate anti-Soviet. Okay, well, we can't depend on those folks anymore. Okay, and so what we have to do is kind of what Scott is saying. You know, we did this before. We were able to stop nuclear war, nuclear buildups. The Russians are very, very sensitive and very worried about this. Even though, in my view, President Putin will be very perspicacious. He's already shown that he can use weaponry that could carry a nuclear warhead, but he's got weaponry that doesn't have to. He said, "Well, this is new. This is sort of like we're testing it. It works." I mean, that's tongue in cheek in his announcement yesterday, but it does work, all right? And what we need to do is make sure that we don't face Russia with a choice between a humiliating retreat and the use of nuclear weapons. That's why we have to get off our rear ends. That's why we have to tell all our friends. We have to make it clear that American citizens act as if we lived in a democracy. We got to stop this, and we got to stop it soon. Thank you very much for letting me speak. Thanks, Scott, for hanging in there.
Thank you, Ray.
Okay, so I want to remark here, okay, that it's clear with this new weapon, okay, that what Russia's doing is facing us with the choice, okay, of making a retreat, which could be perceived as humiliating for us, okay, or alternatively, going nuclear ourselves. So why doesn't the same thing apply to us, okay, as Ray has applied to Russia? The answer is Ukraine is not really a vital interest for us. It's far away from the United States. It doesn't really hurt us very greatly as a nation to have our forces, the ones we're supporting inside of Ukraine, actually lose this war. That is not a vital interest for us. We have to reflect on how this war started in the first place. It started because we had been provoking the Russians from 2014, and even before that, but from 2014 up to the present. That's what we had been doing. We overturned a democratically elected regime in 2014, supported a coup. And in the years since then, we've been building up the armed force of Ukraine. Why? to weaken Russia, to hurt Russia, to overturn the regime in Russia. In other words, we've been the aggressor in this context. So Russia, for its part, would not be just faced with a humiliating defeat, but if they were defeated inside of Ukraine, they would be faced with an existential threat. So they cannot retreat. Come what may, they have to win this particular war, and they are winning this particular war. But the truth is, when looked at objectively from on high, we don't have to win this particular war. This war was the product of an adventure by us. We can stop the adventurism. We can learn to play nice in the sandbox, okay, with other nations. So we aren't really faced with the same kind of capitulation or nuclear war choice that the Russians are. But it was they who, in introducing this new weapon, also introduced a safeguard against having to go nuclear. Because now they can reply to us and reply to NATO and can devastate our bases and the cities of NATO without having to go nuclear. So the step they took, while it increases tensions, generally speaking, actually introduces a third choice into this situation, which did not exist before. D, anything to add?
I'm just shaking my head here with this whole situation. But like I said, it's got to stop. It's just got to stop. But the U.S. with the hegemonic mindset, it's the problem. And you got Lindsey Graham screaming, we're not leaving. There's trillions of dollars there, trillions of dollars of resources there. You know, it's sick. It's just a very sick mindset.
Is the trillions of dollars of stuff there? Is that worth a nuclear war, which is going to kill hundreds of millions of people on both sides, or even destroy human life on Earth?
Lindsey Graham doesn't care.
Lindsey Graham doesn't care. But of course, from my point of view, the choice is obvious in this instance. The choice should be life. The trillions of dollars don't matter as much as life. And besides that, it's not our trillions of dollars. It's trillions of dollars that are going to go, as we would later see, to very large corporations that have created vital interests for themselves in terms of investments they've made in Ukraine. They've not made those investments on our behalf. They've made those investments so they could get richer. Why should we be concerned about that? Why should we be concerned about what Lindsey Graham has to say?
Right, and you look at all the lives lost in Ukraine, and the people that left Ukraine, their lives, everybody's life was turned upside down, and then all the lives that were destroyed.
Yes, and here we have to keep in mind the Ukraine started the war with 40 million people who were living in it. Now the estimates are they're down to 16 to 18 million people okay, in Ukraine. Of course, not all those have been killed. They've gone to other countries. They're all over the world now. They are refugees. I mean, most probably, 1.5 to 2 million were killed, which is a very high percentage. But the point is, so many lives were disrupted. So many lives were damaged. So many families were broken up. Why? Because of these investments Lindsey Graham is talking about. I know some people are going to say, well, it's because of democracy. I mean, we had to defend, democracy, okay, in Ukraine. That's such a stupid thing to say, because since 2014, there hasn't been any democracy in Ukraine. And as the years have gone by, less and less democracy. All the political parties, except a few, have been outlawed. There's tight control of the press. There's suppression of any dissent. There's a president, okay, and a ruling body, which now doesn't have any legitimacy because they never held an election. This year, there was supposed to be an election in Ukraine, but they said because of the emergency, they weren't going to hold it. This was in violation of their constitution. So Zelensky occupies the presidency of Ukraine completely illegitimately right now. There's no democracy in Ukraine. We haven't been struggling for democracy. We haven't been defending democracy. We've been defending an authoritarian regime that is forcing people into the armed forces by gunpoint. That's the truth of the matter.
And we're in there on behalf of corporations.
Yes, such as BlackRock. We're in there on behalf of corporations to protect their investment. Okay, in the history of the United States, when we went into foreign countries and we intervened in foreign countries, it has most often been on behalf, okay, of corporations. That was the case for the first part of the 20th century. For a while, in the post-war period, when we intervened, it often was for ideological reasons. Okay, it often was about some abstract ideals we had and defending certain countries against the rise of communism and stuff like that. But in recent years, I would say since the 1980s, the early 1980s, we've been intervening in other nations, especially in Latin America, but also in Africa, and certainly, in the Ukraine war. We've been intervening there on behalf of corporate interests and their desire to exploit the mineral wealth of Ukraine and the agricultural wealth of Ukraine, or the potential agricultural wealth of Ukraine. Okay, I'll go on.
McGovern. So next, I'm going to go to Professor Steve Starr, who actually has requested that he gets response from people on the panel. He's an expert on nuclear weapons and has been a professor at the University of Missouri and former director of the university's clinical laboratory science. Do we have you there, Professor Steve Starr?
Yes, you do. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Please go ahead.
Okay. Well, I share my screen here. I have a PowerPoint presentation. I'd like to begin by emphasizing that Russia considers itself at war with the United States and European nations, specifically the UK, since the US and UK have launched their missiles into the territory of Russia. This was a statement made by President Putin on September 12th when Keir Starmer came to the White House when they were set to initiate this attack, but was delayed until, well, after Trump was elected.
Речь идет не о том, чтобы разрешать украинскому режиму наносить удары по России этим оружием или не разрешать. Речь идет о том, чтобы принять решение о том, что страны НАТО напрямую участвуют в военном конфликте или нет. Если это решение будет принято, это будет означать не что иное, как прямое участие стран НАТО, Соединенных Штатов, европейских стран в войне на Украине. Это их прямое участие. И это уже, конечно, существенным образом меняет саму суть, саму природу конфликта. Это будет означать, что страны НАТО, США, европейские страны воюют с Россией. Речь идет.
So they went ahead and attacked Russia anyway. And the U.S. hides behind the fig leaf that they're allowing Ukraine to make these decisions. But as President Putin pointed out, the decisions are made in Washington. The targeting decisions, the programming is all being done by the United States technicians. And the result was that the other day, Russia used its new intermediate range ballistic missile to strike Ukraine. And this is a MIRV warhead, which means it can carry multiple warheads. There looked like there were 6 different separate groups of weapons. So, and some people say that there were 36 total projectiles that hit. I don't know. I believe Larry Johnson suggested it could have been 6 missiles. But at any rate, these are nuclear capable. And Russia was making the point. So what else has happened? Well, a couple of days ago, it was on Judge Napolitano's broadcast. Colonel McGregor stated that Russia has placed its nuclear forces on full alert.
Well, I have at least 2 sources right now telling me that Russian nuclear rocket forces are on full alert. They are at the highest level of readiness they have ever achieved, which means that they are literally a short message away from launching nuclear warheads on missiles against anyone that threatens them, whether it's the United States or its surrogates in Eastern Europe. So that much has happened, which suggests to me that the Russians have taken this very seriously.
I would think that the United States would make a corresponding increase in its DEFCON status if they detect that Russia has done that. So it's very likely that both the United States and Russia have moved to very close to nuclear warfighting status with their DEFCON. Russia has begun production of mobile nuclear shelters and distributing these. These are protected citizens from various threats, particularly radiation. They can be equipped with air filters. Russia recently announced, the spokesperson for the foreign ministry announced that the Aegis Ashore missile base in Poland is now a priority target. The U.S. also has a similar base in Romania. The Polish base is 741 miles away from Moscow. That's about the distance of Quebec City from Washington, D.C. The Romanian base is 811 miles. That's like Thunder Bay over on the northern edge of Lake Superior for Washington. I suspect the United States wouldn't appreciate that if they had missile bases placed in those locations. These systems use a MK-41 vertical launch system, and it can be used to launch nuclear-armed Tomahawk cruise missiles. This is a selection of missiles that can be used. You can see in the center anti-air warfare, the SM-6 missile, which may eventually be replaced with a hypersonic weapon that can hit Moscow in 4 to 5 minutes. I suppose it could be fitted with a nuclear warhead. But you can see over here, the Tomahawk missile is one of the weapons that's loaded into the Mark 41. This is an image of the missile being loaded into it on the Aegis Ashores. The Aegis systems are used on naval vessels, so that's why they call it a shore. Well, Russia can't verify what's in those containers. You can see over to the right that the missile goes in the container, and that's the structure. So you can understand why Russia would consider this to be a priority target, because the Tomahawk missile can hit Moscow in about an hour or so, and the hypersonic weapons that soon to follow will be in a matter of minutes. I think that if they're foolish enough to attack the Kursk nuclear power plant, they could start a nuclear war. Russia would retaliate with a nuclear strike. The nuclear power plant is within range of all the missiles, the ATACMS and Storm Shadow Scout missiles, and it has 2 older nuclear reactors that are not protected by concrete containment. A concerted attack with a swarm of missiles could be, even though the Russians have been shooting down the ATACMS and Storm Shadows, it doesn't mean that if they get hit with a swarm of them, they'll get every single one. Each of these reactors and its spent fuel pools contains at least 10 times more long.
Yeah, just a comment here. The record of Russian success against ATACMS and Storm Shadows and Scalps, and here I have to add that these missiles have been used by the Ukrainians inside of Ukraine for some time now. I think for over a year now. Okay, so there's a record of how successful the Russians are in shooting them down. They get roughly 90% of them, but that means 10% of them are getting through and doing some damage. So if a swarm of them, to attack, the reactors, there's a good chance some of them are going to get through and create some damage in the reactors. That's very dangerous, of course, for Russia.
Long-lived radiation that was released by the 1986 Chernobyl disaster. You can see this is a comparison. The RBMK Chernobyl type reactors at Kursk. These are the 2 there. But a modern reactor has a cylindrical concrete dome. It's about 3 feet thick and lined with steel. So they're much more difficult to hit. This is an interior view of the Chernobyl 2 reactor and the Kursk reactor. On the left is Chernobyl. That in the back, that's is the top of the reactor. That's the top of the reactor, and this one adjacent to that is the spent fuel pool. So they're right next to each other in a building that's not protected. This is an image that the French nuclear IRSN organization created to show the spread of cesium-137 after the Chernobyl reactor blew up in 1986. These reactors have a graphite core which will burn. So the line at the bottom down there shows as the progression over a 3-week period as the radiation spread throughout Europe, and I mean it went everywhere. We got some in North America too, but the areas around Chernobyl and Belarus were really hard hit. This is a map and I made it in 1996 by the CIA. The darkest red areas are the exclusion zones. They're too radioactive for people to live in. There's still about 1,100 square mile there. Cesium-137 has a 30-year half-life, so to get 5 half-lives, you will get down to about 3%. 10 half-lives, 1%, but you're talking about 200 to 300 years before you can really live in an area like that. But that shows you what the implications of hitting these reactors. Well, of course, the U.S. and Russia can each launch 800 to 1,000 strategic nuclear warheads at each other in a matter of minutes. Another thing they can do, Russia's developed these. This slide was made by Dr. Postal. They have the Poseidon robot unmanned submarine.
Okay, so the Ted Postal is a professor at emeritus, okay, at MIT, who works in this area and who's very well known in terms of evaluation and assessment of weapons and weapons effectiveness, things like that. So this slide, okay, was Ted Postal's.
It's a drone. It's very large. You can see the image of the man standing above it. And Dr. Postal showed that it can fit a 100 megaton warhead in the tip of this. These things can go faster than our torpedoes. They have unlimited range. They can loiter. This is a picture of the Belgorod sub that carries them. You can see the 6 holes in the front where they would be launched. There are 2 of these now that are deployed. This is an image of a 100 megaton, well, this is a 50 megaton bomb that was detonated in 1961 by the Russians. I believe this photograph was taken at least 75 or 100 miles away from the detonation. It's detonated in a remote area where there weren't a lot of forests or anything, but had it been detonated in an area where it was heavily forested or urban, would set enormous fires. Dr. Postal created an image of what it would happen if the Belgorod used 6 of these torpedoes, these drone submarines, to hit the East Coast. And the largest yellow circular area depicts a fire zone. Would be 17,000 square kilometers or 6,500 square miles for each one of these detonations would be set on fire. This is a video I created some time ago that shows what happens. I shortened it a little bit, but it shows what happens when Russians respond with an attack on NATO forces, and it goes from there. Or counterforce strikes where the U.S. responds and hitting targets in Russia to take out its nuclear forces, but it's not going to arrive in time to do that, and a full-scale nuclear war results. And there'll be more than 4,000 nuclear detonations that incinerate all the major cities in the U.S., Europe. China would probably be involved too, but the massive nuclear firestorms from these would literally cover hundreds of thousands of square miles. Everything that's flammable in the fire zone would burn. There would be no survivors. the air temperatures get to above the boiling point of water. So if you live in a city, that would be what you would be looking at. The scientific studies predict that 150 to 180 million tons of smoke and soot would rise into the stratosphere. And in a matter of 10 days to 2 weeks, the high winds in the stratosphere would spread it around the world. It would cause a global stratospheric smoke layer to form. And this smoke would block about 70% of the sunlight in the northern hemisphere and 35% in the southern. It would also destroy the protective ozone layer. That wouldn't be noticed immediately, but it would after the smoke begins to dissipate. That would be actually about 10 years before it really would go away. So 70% of the sunlight means that it's going to be at noon on a day in June, say in the northern hemisphere, it would be like having a full moon out at midnight. That's how much sunlight you would get. Southern hemisphere would be a little bit less than that, but it would still cause temperatures to be too cold for many years to grow crops. And, you know, the cold weather would cause the death of most humans and land animals. Initially, the daily temperatures would fall below freezing every day for up to 3 years in central North America and central Eurasia. So that's what we're looking at with a nuclear war. Kennedy warned us about this, and this is a little, you know, we're still at a point where we can stop this.
Never have the nations of the world had so much to lose or so much to gain. Together we shall save our planet, or together we shall perish in its flames. Save it we can, and save it we must. And then shall we earn the eternal thanks of mankind, and as peacemakers, the eternal blessing of God.
Well, Trump may be no Kennedy, but I agree with Scott Ritter that he needs to act, contact the Russians, do everything he can to stop this. I would also suggest that Biden needs to be impeached. And Francis Boyle has written up articles of impeachment that are available. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Starr, for that. And I actually would like to ask, especially given that you're a former UN weapons inspector, Scott Ritter, if you
Okay, so I'd like to say about that presentation, it was a relatively brief presentation, but it is certainly pretty devastating. And it reminds us of the horror, okay, of nuclear war. The last comments by Professor Starr advocating for the impeachment of Joe Biden at this point are very well taken. Okay, that is to say, to authorize the use of ATACMS and the Storm Shadows and the Scalps, those types of missiles, in terms of shooting them into to Russia proper, in the context of the warnings by Putin. Those actions were so irresponsible as to justify the impeachment of Joe Biden right now, because this policy of accelerating things so as to take away the freedom of action of Donald Trump and keep him embroiled, okay, in the Ukraine war, so risky to the rest of us and so irresponsible that they warrant, the immediate impeachment of the president. And as far as I'm concerned, bringing him up on charges, afterwards. Okay, now, if people have been following this stream for some time, they must know that I am among the most anti-Trump people, alive. I have never been, though, pro-Biden. I'm not approaching this, okay, from this angle. But I have long considered Joe Biden to be one of the worst presidents in American history. I'm well aware of his domestic record, some of the promising aspects, of that record. But you have to weigh things. And the idea of a president running a foreign policy that puts us at risk, at serious risk of a nuclear war for the first time in 40 years, that alone qualifies him as one of the worst presidents, if not the worst president in the history of the United States, in my view. Okay, Dee, any comments about that?
I would agree with you. His foreign policy has been disastrous.
It
And
has.
then tip it off with Russia.
Yeah, and we've mainly focused in this stream on his foreign policy, with respect to Russia, okay, and Ukraine. But of course, we haven't talked about the horrors of his foreign policy with respect to Israel and Gaza. I mean, to get us involved in enabling a genocide and refuse to stop. He has dishonored the whole country. He has stained our future. Okay, let us go on.
You have a response to Professor Steve Starr. Oh, I think you're muted there, my friend.
There we go. Okay.
There we go.
Said I want to applaud him for laying out this case succinctly, accurately, dispassionately, almost too dispassionately. It's not a criticism. It's a reflection of his professionalism, except that people should be changing their underwear in fear after listening to what he said. And yet I think his soothing voice has calmed us into believing that maybe this was just another, academic presentation. It wasn't. He was laying out the imminent demise of mankind. And I want to reinforce that point. The Russian weapon that was used. I'm getting ready to publish a paper on this today, if we make it. That breaks down what I think it is. There's not much literature out there, but if you know the history of Russian ballistic missile design and such, this was a weapon that it's related to a weapon that the Russians were developing, the Soviets were developing back in the early 1980s, called the Skorost. And the Skorost missile, 15Ja 66, was quickly developed by then Minister of Defense Ustinov to respond to the planned deployment of Pershing II missiles by the United States into Germany. The Russians were very afraid of the Pershing II because once you launched the Pershing II, 7 minutes later, it hit Moscow. And the Russians were not happy about that. So they built this missile, the Skorost, which was an amalgam of components drawn from the SS-20 Pioneer, the Mod 3 version of the Pioneer, the SS-25, which was still under development, the SS-27, which was top secret under development. Nobody even knew it existed. And they put it all together in a two-stage missile, topped with conventional warheads, and they were going to flood Czechoslovakia and East Germany with these systems and monitor on a continuous basis the Pershing 2 bases. And the moment the Pershing 2 went to the field in a in a manner that looks suspicious, they would take it out preemptively. That was what the Skorost was all about, to preemptively take out emerging threats. The system was nearing production when the INF, in fact, it was ready to go into production in March of 1987, but in December, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, so the Skorost went the way of history. And in doing so, the Skorost, people need to understand, again, I keep telling people, there was a time when we talked to the Soviets. There's a time when we talked to the Russians. I spent a lot of time at the Russian embassy in the last 2 years attending functions and talking to Anatoly Antonov, the ambassador, and talking to Major General Bobkin, the defense attaché, and talking to his officers and having very detailed conversations. I just remind, Bobkin was a former, when we started talking, he's a strategic rocket forces guy who was in an SS-25 unit in Novosibirsk when I inspected it in 1990. What a small world we live in. And he was sent to the United States to help facilitate arms control talks, how to prevent the very crisis that we're in. Anatoly Antonov is an expert on the United States. He speaks English fluently. And he was, of course, the man who negotiated the New START Treaty with Rose Guttmuller. He was ready to engage again on extending the New START to prevent exactly what's happening. Anatoly Antonov was here for 7 years, and the U.S. didn't talk to him. Bobkin arrived, and the first thing that happened is that the Ukrainians got him blackballed in the defense attaché circuit. So nobody talked to him.
Okay, so this happened. If Antonov was here for 7 years, he was here during the Trump administration. Then he was here during the Biden administration. And he couldn't get people engaged in talks about arms control or disarmament. And Botkin was here for years too. And the Ukrainians were successful in blackballing him. So he could not talk to his defense counterparts here in Washington, so there could be no communication. How dangerous is that? How stupid.
Had they talked to him, as I did, they would have gotten an insight into how the strategic rocket forces felt about the INF treaty, about the START treaty, about disarmament, about what Gorbachev did to them, and how they feel that impacted their national security. And you would understand that they were very bitter about this entire experience. They felt that they had been weakened by it and that they were ready to regain the former glory of the Soviet strategic rocket forces. If you know anything, again, if you've studied Russian military history, Soviet military history, you understand that the present day is very much influenced by the past. So when the United States withdraws from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty in 2019 under President Reagan, Putin said, we view this treaty as being very important to prevent war. And so we will not develop new intermediate range systems, and will act as if the treaty is in force so long as you don't deploy intermediate systems into Europe. Of course, earlier this year in a NATO exercise in Denmark, we deployed intermediate nuclear forces, intermediate range missiles, nuclear capable, to Denmark. And Putin said, okay, we're moving forward. And the byproduct of this is the missile that was tested the other day. But people don't understand what this missile is. This missile is the modern day version of the Skorost. You see, the Russians are building a missile that can be pushed forward and be ready to preempt Dark Eagle, our intermediate missile. The Russians just put the Mark 41 Aegis Ashore on notice in Poland. That is a target. The target that will destroy it is this. Look at what this was. This is a missile that makes use of not the YARS, which is what the Rubiej, the RS-26, this is derived from, used the YARS first stage. This uses the Kader first stage, the Cedar. Now, most people don't know what the Cedar is, but the Ukrainians just came out and said that it's the Cedar. How would they know? Well, they have the debris, and on the debris are serial numbers, and the serial numbers show what the booster was. This is the most modern booster that the Russians have. Similar in size to the ours, so it doesn't change the configuration of the system, but it has unique solid fuel principles that allow the missile to burn in variable speeds, making it impossible to target. The other thing it does is it doesn't use traditional MIRVs. I keep hearing people say multiple, independently targeted warheads. That's not what this was, not at all. This is the new system. The new system is, instead of a bus, a plate, so to speak, where the warheads are attached, that separates from the missile and then comes in and releases the warheads to their target on a trajectory, though, because it's still moving as this happens. What we have now is independent mini missiles that are there, and they fire themselves. So the first stage takes it up, second stage puts it in, and then you fire these independent missiles. And these missiles, each one of them had 6 large submunitions on them. This is where the name hazelnut comes from. Because if you look at a hazelnut tree, you look at the pod of nuts, it's exactly what you see with these submunitions coming down. This missile was developed specifically to take out Dark Eagle missile arrays. If you take a look at the layout, the footprint of the Dark Eagle, where the radar is, where the command and communications are, where this missile is designed to annihilate that. People kept saying, where's the explosion? It's not meant to be high explosive. It's meant to be a kinetic kill. And these submunitions come down and they will kinetically kill everything on the ground. These submunitions come down at such velocity that if they hit the Aegis ashore, it will be a smoking hole in the ground. This is what this missile is designed. Putin just put us on notice that he has a conventional missile system that is designed to preempt anything and everything NATO plans on doing to Russia, and there is no NATO response. There's nothing they can do about it. This is literally the equivalent of the most alpha wolf in the world coming in and pissing all over your home. That's what Putin just did. And it didn't have to be this way. Putin said right there, your withdrawal from the INF Treaty was the greatest mistake you have ever made, because now you have compelled us to do this. And here we are. We didn't want to be here, but because of all the provocations you've done, we have checkmated you. And that's the case. I don't think the West has woken up to what has just happened. It is over for the West. The only thing we can do is nuclear war. And sadly, we have somebody who believes that we can have a nuclear exchange. I just, again, want to have people reflect on what that means. It means the Biden administration is ready to sacrifice 100 million Americans for Ukraine.
Just a comment on this. First of all, I loved the explanation of the Russian system that Scott has given here. It becomes very plain what's involved in this particular system and why it's so powerful, and indefensible. I think we all can get a common sense understanding of what's involved in the new Russian system, the Oreshnik, it's called, the Oreshnik system. So that is one thing. But Scott also makes it clear why now there may be a choice between capitulation, and going to a nuclear war. And then, of course, he also begins to talk what the fatalities would be in such a war, the 100 million Americans. But here, I think he's underestimating, based on what we saw in Steve Starr's presentation. We're probably dealing with the death, of almost all Americans, if there is, a nuclear war. Now, Rear Admiral Buchanan, the Navy Rear Admiral, who was part of SAC, envisions a nuclear exchange, the connotation being, that it would be a limited exchange. Scott, of course, does not believe that it can possibly be limited. And he thinks the Rear Admiral, in implying that it can be, is being very, very irresponsible and never should have made that public statement. Colonel McGregor completely agrees. He thinks the rear admiral and his superior should both be immediately fired for making that statement because it's so inflammatory to the Russians. Okay. But from our point of view, we have to understand how dangerous the escalation by the Biden administration is, what it caused the Russians to do in retaliation, and the system of choices that now comes to us as a result of the escalation and this new dangerous situation in which we find ourselves. Any further comments on D?
No, we can continue.
Okay.
The Biden administration is ready to sacrifice 100 million Americans for Ukraine. And is that what we want? So I want to thank Professor Starr for his presentation. It's fantastic. But guys, this is as real as it gets. This isn't theoretical. The reason why I went through all this, the stuff about this missile, is to point out that sometimes when people talk about weapon systems and all that, people feel a little remote from it. They don't identify with it because it's something they don't understand. And so I wanted to bring it in a way that hopefully everybody understood what's going on, what this represents, how real this missile is, and what the consequences of our actions are in compelling Russia to develop this missile, and now the impossible situation it's put us in. Because understand, it has put us in an impossible situation, a very dangerous situation. By revealing this missile and showing his willingness to use this, Putin has literally given the West two options: capitulate or nuclear war. We have to find a way to find a third option. We have to find a way to get in between. We have to find a way to communicate. And this is a communication that isn't just amongst an American audience. We have to communicate with the Russians. Now, we can't do it directly because that's against the law, apparently. That's the Logan Act. But we can do it indirectly. For instance, me talking to you. If a Russian is listening to this, copy it to another Russian and copy it to another Russian and get this goddamn message. Excuse my language, but I'm very upset, guys, because we're going to die. And I sort of wanted to spend Christmas with my family. I had big plans for Christmas, and I don't think we're going to have a Christmas right now. That's how dangerous this situation is. We have to stop it. We have to pull out all the stops. We have to communicate with our fellow Americans. We have to send the signal to Donald Trump that you can't just sit there and let this happen. You were elected to prevent this, and they're going around you. You must speak out now. I've invited Trump to come to the rally, to speak out, to let his voice be heard, to rally the American people around him. I'm not asking for a January 6th. I'm asking for a December 7th. It's a beautiful day to do it on, Pearl Harbor Day. Wouldn't it be nice if we could actually reverse the historical legacy of Pearl Harbor, and instead of celebrating December 7th every year as a day when the Japanese attacked, it's celebrated as the day that the American people saved their lives and saved the world while they're at it. And after we do it on December 7th, we can then on December 8th reflect on the fact that that's when the INF Treaty was signed. And maybe we can start promoting arms control and get a new INF Treaty signed so that this new missile that the Russians have developed can go back into the trash heap of history. And the Dark Eagle goes in the trash heap of history. And once again, sanity prevails as we eliminate the single most destabilizing weapons in the world, which are these intermediate range nuclear weapons. December 7th and December 8th, could have picked two more historically relevant dates. Let's help make them relevant. Let's redefine December 7th, and let's breathe new life into December 8th. Again, thank you, Professor Starr.
Thank you, Scott Ritter.
Thanks, Scott.
Go ahead, Steve, if you wanted to say something real quick.
Thanks for the kind words. I wish I was as an effective speaker as Scott is. And I didn't mean to misinform about the MIRVs. I didn't understand that about the new weapon system.
No, you didn't misinform. I just spent the whole night. I'm looking tired because once I get involved in something like this, I can't stop it. It's what I did in the Marine Corps. It's what I did in every job I ever had. Once I got an idea, I just had to keep digging and digging and digging. I've been spending all night putting this together, and I just hope there's enough energy left in my body to put it on paper and get it published, because I think it's something that everybody needs to know.
Well, I also saw that Ray McGovern, you turned your camera on. I just wanted to check with you to see if you had a response, and I'll make an acknowledgement that Larry Johnson has also joined us, so we'll go to him after that. Ray, but did you have something to say as well?
I do. Can I be heard?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, good. Well, I want to thank both Scott and Steve. This is the necessary factual input to get us not only concerned, but angry and willing to get off our rear ends and do something about it. We all can do something about it, right? Aaron Bushnell, when asked why he self-immolated, said that, people ask, what would you have done during the genocide in Nazi Germany? Now with the genocide in Gaza, well, you're doing it now. And we're all doing what we should do now, except we're not doing it. So let's take advantage of what Scott is inviting us to do. A couple of small things. First, a straw in the wind, some good news. Okay, there is a link, a communications channel between the U.S. and Russia. It's Secretary of Defense Austin with Belousov, the defense minister in Moscow. That, as far as I know, is operative. They do share, and they have been be able to prevent really bad things. And it's my guess, just a guess, that Blinken and Sullivan didn't want Austin in on the act, didn't inform him about the president's decision, because they weren't sure what Austin would do and what he might tell Belousov. Okay.
Okay, I have to add. Does everybody know how unconstitutional that is? Lloyd Austin is the Secretary of Defense. He is the immediate superior of all of the military people. Going around him, not keeping him in the loop about this. Those are grounds for immediate dismissal of Blinken and Sullivan. You can't go around the Secretary of Defense when it comes to warlike actions. He is in the line of command of those soldiers inside of Ukraine. who were helping the Ukrainians, who were actually taking the vital actions to send those missiles into Russia. The Secretary of Defense has the capacity to say yes or no to this. Now, the president can fire the Secretary of Defense and get a new one if he wants to. But it is unconstitutional to bypass the Secretary of Defense in this. He has to get the chance to say yes or no. He has to get the chance to resign if necessary, publicly resign, and tell people why he's resigning in this instance. The other two had no right to go behind the back of the Secretary of Defense and exclude him from the decision-making process. And they deserve to be immediately fired for that. The president should fire them immediately.
Now, Putin has made it clear that there's no defense against these weapons, that he will warn civilians to get out of the way because he's so confident that if he gave them a couple of days' notice, they still wouldn't put up a defense against it. That's because these missiles, well, even though they're new, even though they're just being tested, look what they did to Dnipropetrovsk, there, that big missile factory right in the middle of Ukraine. So, last thing here, 7 minutes. Now, when the SS-20s were put into European Russia, and when the Pershing IIs were put into Western Europe, Gorbachev finally decided his trust level with Reagan was so high, they said, let's get rid of these damn things. Long story short, they weren't needed. Okay, they only gave 7 minutes notice. They were destroyed. The first time in history that a whole class of missilery was destroyed in place with the warheads and everything else. Scott, to his great credit, spent 2 years in that garden spot called Kinsk in the middle of Siberia, or in the Urals, to verify that. What am I saying here? I'm saying that there is this experience. Now, that was between Gorbachev and Reagan, okay? Reagan learned something from that scare in 1983 that I told you about before. Maggie Thatcher learned something about that, and she was one of the influences on Reagan to come to this deal. The deal was sealed. The weapons were destroyed. Who got out of that treaty? That treaty lasted for 32 years. That's longer than the ABM treaty, which we also got out of. Okay, 32 years until Trump decided to exit the treaty. Why? Best guess is that the Army that the Army, Air Force, and Navy put such pressure on him that he had no other choice. So you're a Putin now, and you're looking at all this, okay? Well, what do? You mention Trump in this very, very formal, very, 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 very alarming speech, and you say, look, I was under Trump, 2019, that we got out of this, okay? So we can't depend on Trump. We know the power of the military-industrial complex. We don't know who's in charge in Washington, and that adds to the very delicate situation right now, as if more were necessary. So just want to chime in with those things. 7 minutes, SS-20, Squatus missiles. I think Squatus means the fastest missiles you can produce. They were ready. Let's hope that that rational thought prevails, but it's probably not going to do that unless we get out and do the kinds of things that Scott is suggesting and tell people about the things that Stephen put up so brilliantly in warning about what actually happens. And that admiral that admiral that thinks we could have a limited nuclear war should be cashiered on the spot by Austin if he still has any authority over the Defense Department. And that's all I wanted to say. Thanks for letting me comment.
Thank you, Ray McGovern. And
Okay, so I'm going to stop it actually right there because I want to leave time to talk about the third way. Scott talks about or suggests there has to be a third option, that we have to find, okay, a third option. So let me talk about that. But before I do, have you any comments, Dee?
No, let's just continue on because I would just pretty much be repeating myself. So,
Okay. Okay, so I've been giving considerable thought to what kinds of other options we might have. First, I think the possibility of finding more hopeful options does lie with Trump, and I'll explain why in just a minute, but also why it does not lie, okay, with Biden. I'll start off by talking about that. Biden, I think we're all agreed, cannot think anymore. His cognition is really damaged. He's not a functioning president anymore. I was never a particular fan, okay, of Biden. But even 2 years ago, he was much more capable of rational thought, than he is now. He's obviously being led around by the nose. Okay. And the question is, who is leading him around by the nose? I think it's Blinken, okay, and Sullivan, that he relies on them to tell him what he should be doing in these particular situations. And so we have to ask, what is their mindset? And what kind of freedom does their mindset give to them to actually negotiate, to actually find, okay, a third way? Or are they locked into the mindset now of either capitulating or going to nuclear war? We have to seriously ask that particular question. I think the meaning of Rear Admiral Buchanan's statement is that there are some people within the Defense Department who see things in terms of this choice that was outlined by Scott. Either give up or go to nuclear war. Now, in order to think of new options, you have to think about the larger picture. Okay, now, we didn't go through the whole of the stream here. There was a short presentation by Larry Johnson. There was another short presentation by Dennis. I'm sorry, his last name, is escaping me now. He gave a pretty good presentation, a little rambling. But the central point of his presentation was that we have to think in terms of a larger world out there. It's not simply the United States and Russia and Ukraine, or the United States and NATO and Russia, and Ukraine that we have to focus on. We have to also focus on the fact that there's a whole world of stakeholders here that are moving in an entirely different sort of direction. And that somehow might offer possibilities for a third option in trying to negotiate a settlement of the Ukraine issues. And so he calls on us to try to think about, this guy Dennis is calling on us to think about a third option that sees things through the lens of a new security and development framework that is good for the whole world. Now, I think the first thing we have to notice is that Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan don't seem to have the wherewithal to think about actually negotiating a new security and development framework for the rest of the world. That framework involves the kinds of considerations that are driving the BRICS developments in the world, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization developments in the world, all the alternative institutions that are being created now, by the Eurasian countries, including China, of course, and Russia, Iran, the whole group of those nations, and all their movements to create an alternative to the framework created by the collective West, the framework in which the U.S. is the hegemon, and everybody else somehow serves us. We all know that cannot continue. But we still have roughly 60 days, it's less now, it must be 58 days or so. We still have 58 days where people wedded to the old framework are governing things and evidently are intending to accelerate the conflict inside of Ukraine to tie the hands of Trump when he comes in. What we have to do now, in terms of the kind of action that Scott is suggesting, but also other actions that the Schiller Institute is going to take, and all of the other people who are thinking about trying to have a third way on this, we all have to do something to exert as much influence as we can to get Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and Joe Biden to get off the pot, to use an old expression. They need to understand they are in a transition period. In the election, their policies were rejected by the American people. They have to respect that particular decision. They have to recognize first that it is illegitimate to try to tie the hands of the new president when it comes to foreign policy, to try to lock in your old foreign policy that has clearly failed. We have to present them with resistance of a very public nature to say, we as a collective did not vote for your foreign policy. We voted against it. We don't want it to continue. And we are prepared to develop a mass movement to displace you and even punish you if you keep on following this foreign policy. We are totally against it, and we can't have it. And there are things that we eventually can do to hold you accountable. You can be brought up on charges. When it comes to the president, you can be impeached still. There are things that can be done to penalize you for not respecting the decision that was made, in this election. We have to make that clear. We have to make our displeasure clear. What is our displeasure about? Our displeasure is about exposing us to the risks of nuclear war and to keep pushing those risks upon us until the very last day that you have power. We have to impress on them how illegitimate that is. Why do we have to do this? Because they are incapable of thinking of a third way, of thinking about certain other options. What are those kinds of options? Well, I'm going to sort of express them in terms of outline, especially in terms of Ukraine, what the options are for Trump that don't appear to be there for Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Joe Biden. From the standpoint of Sullivan and Biden, and Blinken, if they simply allow the Russians to win the war over the next couple of months, then they look like they have capitulated. They look like they have lost this war and not gotten anything positive out of it. It makes them look like they're total failures. Now, in reality, of course, they are total failures. But because of their culpability in getting us to this point, their freedom of action is quite constrained. And all we can really do with them is to get them to stand down with as much of a mass movement as we can develop over this period of time, which we should do. We ought to support what Scott Ritter is doing to the fullest. But we also have to recognize the different options that Trump has. Much earlier in this stream, I talked about the Trump idea of getting rid of NATO. Once Trump comes into office, if the war is going on, he cannot stop it in 24 hours, as he says. But one thing that he can do is he can stop the shipments of arms and money to Ukraine immediately. That he can do. And while that might not stop the war in one day, it will certainly create chaos among those in Ukraine who want to pursue the war. It will certainly bring on a much quicker collapse of the Ukrainian situation. I think it's collapsing actually pretty quickly now. And in the 60 days, we will continue to see collapse. And I'm hoping and I believe that the end of the war might be a done deal actually by the time that Trump actually gets into office. But the most important thing to consider here is that when he does get into office, he has the option of thinking more freely in terms of a new security and development framework. Now, the Schiller Institute, in the conference it's planning to have on December 7th and December 8th, is going to talk about a new security and development framework. They've been working on such a framework, and they're going to present those ideas on December 7th, and 8th, in their conference. But they're not the only ones who have ideas about this. Before Putin actually started the special military operation in February of 2022. At the end of 2021 and early in 2022, he was appealing to Biden and to the Americans to sit down and develop a new security framework for Europe so there would be no necessity for a war. The Biden administration turned deaf ears on him, would not communicate, would not talk, would not try to develop a settlement. But Putin has for a long time been looking for a new security framework for all of Europe. He's willing to negotiate that. From the standpoint of Trump, if I'm Trump, I'm trying to put myself in his place now. If I'm Trump, I have the freedom to go in there and to talk to Putin about a new security framework. Now, of course, that new security framework, part of implication of that is that we're going to stop our activities inside of Ukraine and assent to the terms that Putin wants to apply to Ukraine. That's going to be part of it. But there's going to be a broader framework that's going to be negotiated if we get down to negotiations with Putin, if Trump gets down to negotiations with Putin. So the question here is, what's in it for Trump? Why would he want to negotiate a new security framework? I think the answer is pretty obvious. Trump would like to get out of NATO. He would like to end our commitments to NATO. For one thing, he would like to save the money. He would like to withdraw from a lot of our bases around the world. Not everywhere. He's got his own problems in terms of Germany. He has an aggressive posture towards China, for example, and an aggressive posture with respect to the Middle East. But with respect to Europe, he doesn't appear to have an aggressive posture. So he has the freedom to negotiate a new security framework for Europe, which can end our commitments to NATO. And that's the big victory that he can get out of a negotiation. He can be the peacemaker, and he can gain the advantages of ending all the expenditures we make with respect to NATO. Because the conclusion of a peace with Russia in terms of Europe, with security guarantees for the Europeans, can end the long, long conflict, okay, inside of Europe, and create a situation which is beneficial for everyone and provide a justification for us to come home from Europe at long last. That would be a fantastic achievement for the Trump administration, okay, and for Trump. And the glory of getting this done would be his. And he's big when it comes to glory. He's someone who wants that. And that would be unambiguously a good thing if he could make peace in that particular sector of the world. But of course, we have to go further than just talking of Europe. We have to recognize that Trump doesn't have such a favorable position, at least not on the surface in terms of his previous commitments of various kinds, when we move over to the Middle East. When we move over to the Middle East, we are in a situation where Trump has made all kinds of verbal commitments to the security of Israel, and even towards the possibility of a one-state solution and not a two-state solution in that particular country. Now, that kind of solution is at variance with the Arab street in all of the Arab countries and with the resistance axis created by Iran. It's also at variance with Russian and Chinese interests in all of West Asia. It's also at variance with the whole movement of BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's at variance with developing trends.
Well, recently Trump did say, with all the excitement in Israel about annexing the West Bank, he said now is not the time. The world is angry about Gaza.
So that Trump said that is a very good sign. But I also think that if Trump engages in a peace process with respect to Ukraine, that he's working together with Putin to get that done. And the great success in getting that done is going to have an effect on Trump. It's going to make him like going through those kinds of efforts to solve a problem where there's a threat, to U.S. existence, where there's a threat of nuclear war in that particular situation. If he gets through that successfully over a period of months, he's not going to want to get into a situation inside of West Asia, which brings us again to the brink of a nuclear war. It'll just be inconsistent with his mindset by that time. So I think he's going to look for a third way in West Asia as well, and that he will be motivated to do that by his success inside of Ukraine.
That's a good point.
And there is a third way for West Asia. Now, here in this stream, and in Dee's stream also, we've often talked about what could be done to facilitate a third way. That is a third way in West Asia. And what could be done there is to change the situation on the ground inside of Palestine so that the facts on the ground are more favorable to a two-state solution, okay, than they are now. Now, part of changing the facts on the ground is going on right now because Hezbollah is so successful, in Lebanon in preventing the expansion of Israel into Lebanon. Hezbollah is in the process of defeating Israel there.
Mm-hmm.
In Gaza, Hamas is still around and is giving Israel fits. I think Israel is taking much higher casualties in Gaza than it expected, than it anticipated. It's much more, of an economic drain. I think the Houthis have been creating an economic chokehold on Israel, which they are feeling because they've put a stop to shipping in the Red Sea going to the port of Eilat, which is now practically shut down. Then, of course, we have the coming attack we've been waiting for, the Iranian retaliation. That could have a tremendous effect in creating chaos in Israel. By the time Trump actually gets to be president, we may have even a much more chaotic situation in terms of Israel than we have now. At that point, the issue won't be Trump supporting a greater Israel, the possibility of a greater Israel. I mean, that won't be in line with the facts on the ground by that time. Instead, what the question will be is saving Israel at all.
Yes.
And the contributors, the whole lobby for Israel, while it's now in back of annihilating the Palestinians and creating a greater Israel from the Nile River, to the Euphrates, inside of the next 2 months, actions occurring on the ground in the conflict may well create a situation where the issue 2 months from now may become, what can we do to save Israel as an independent state? And then the obvious answer is going to be, we have to facilitate somehow a solution that involves 2 independent states in order to get the Arabs off the back of the United States. There has to be an independent Palestinian state and self-determination for the Palestinians. That is simply a reality that Trump is going to have to face up to. And when he starts talking to the Arab states in earnest, and his people start talking to the Arab state, he's going to find himself facing a stone wall about that there's going to have to be a Palestinian state. And he's going to go back and report to the donors and say, look, we have no choice now. There has to be a Palestinian state. And if we want to save Israel, the solution has to be a two-state one. You finally have to support me in that. And if I'm successful in creating a peace inside of the Middle East, then you have to accept that, and you have to continue supporting me with very large contributions anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Because right now, and I'm projecting myself ahead 2 months, 2 months from now, it may be a tremendous accomplishment for Trump just to save the state of Israel at all.
Mm-hmm.
And his donors may end up being grateful just for that. And that Trump can facilitate. That he can do if he wants to. Okay, now I have to say, okay, if Harris had won, the same kind of thinking would have applied to Harris. In other words, if the facts on the ground had changed over the next 2 months in exactly the same way,
Mm-hmm.
then Harris would have been facing those facts on the ground also. And she would have had to stop giving unconditional support to Israel. And she would have had to try to create a solution that involved two states and that was practical. Now, obviously, that involves moving the settlers out of the West Bank. One way or another, that's going to be necessary. Either
Mm-hmm.
repatriate them to Israel or repatriate them to their home countries, but they do not belong on ground that was assigned by the United Nations to the Palestinians. That finally has to be recognized. And I think that would have been the case both with the Democratic administration and the Republican administration. But I personally think that Trump could be made amenable to that if the facts in Israel were to flow in that particular direction, which I think they will over the next 2 months or so. There might even be some benefit in it for Trump and his family. I hate to be so crass, but Kushner, Jared Kushner, is very interested in beachfront property in northern Gaza. The whole of northern Gaza, of course, is devastated anyway, and there's a great cleanup job that has to be undertaken there. And there are all kinds of reasons why the usual interests, like the Black Rocks of the world, would be very interested in that as well, okay, as Kushner. But as well, to create a viable Palestinian state, there's going to have to be some swap of territory. Israel's going to have to give up some territory.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe northern Gaza can be swapped for Israeli territory, which would connect up the rest of Gaza to the West Bank. Now, I haven't figured out what happens to the Negev in that kind of a scenario yet. But I'm sure some kinds of arrangements can be made to allow the Israelis to keep, a good part of the Negev, so that they have their port of Eilat in the south. Some things can probably, be fully negotiated there, and there can be personal gain for Trump, okay, in making such a deal.
Mm-hmm.
In no way do I approve of presidents making deals to uh, uh, benefit themselves on a personal basis. I think that's horrible. If the government of the United States were operating in the way it should be operating, that would be impossible. But right now, first things first involve um, ending the conflicts in Ukraine and West Asia, so the risk of nuclear war can be removed from the situation, and the world can go on, to develop a multipolar system, which is much more peaceful than the second system. And based on the considerations I gave tonight, I do believe that can be done by a Trump administration. And after that is done, we can then worry about the other very disagreeable aspects of the Trump administration. But right now, we have to get the risk of nuclear war out of the way.
Definitely.
And I think we have to throw our weight behind that. And that involves solutions for Europe, a new security framework for Europe, and a new security framework for West Asia also. So there are deals for Trump, the self-described fantastic deal maker, to make, since he considers that such a great part of his identity. Well, I've got some deals for him to make.
Exactly. Yep.
And I believe he's flexible enough in his thinking that he can make those deals. He's much more flexible in his thinking than Biden and Sullivan and Blinken are in their thinking.
That is very true.
I mean, Trump's a goddamn loose cannon. He can think in all kinds of different ways. 98% of them are ridiculous, but he may well have the capability to negotiate some deals that are good for all sides, both in Europe, and in West Asia. Further comments, Dee?
Well, yeah, that's basically it. He calls himself a deal maker, and we'll see what's left after the Iranian response, as we always say. We'll see how things look after Iran responds.
He calls himself a deal maker, so it's his turn to make these deals.
Mm-hmm.
And it's his turn to compensate for the great errors he made in his first term. The two great errors, well, there were some more than just the two great errors, but two of the great errors he made, and perhaps the greatest error he made, was getting out of the INF treaty in 2019. That was a great error. The other error was getting out of the J.C. Poet treaty with Iran. I mean, the latest news from Iran is that they already have the nuclear capability.
Yes, they do.
Okay? And they never would have gotten it if Trump hadn't withdrawn from the damn JCPOA agreement. So Trump is to blame for two very bad things that have happened, but he has the chance to make up for that if, as the great deal maker, he can make these deals. So let us call upon him to make these deals.
Yes, I agree.
Call upon him to be the hero for a change.
Exactly. Let him be the hero. It's more important for there to be peace in the world,
And we're even willing to throw in some beachfront property for Jared Kushner in northern Gaza.
Yeah, what's her name? Daniela Weiss was recently there in northern Gaza.
Oh, yeah, give a present to Daniela. Jeez. I mean, cool her jets.
Yeah, she snuck in. with the military.
I'm sure she snuck in with the military. They probably carried her in on one of those old-fashioned, things you see in the movies about the Middle East. I don't even know what they're called.
I know, I can vision it. Yep.
Yeah,
Oh
carried
God.
Daniela quite soon, okay, on the shoulders of some husky Israeli soldiers. Anyway,
Crazy
so
world.
we have some work ahead of us. The work ahead of us, number one, is for Biden and his administration to cool their jets until the end of his presidency. Just let things happen inside of Ukraine. And it would be even better if you stopped shipping arms to Israel, too. I mean, if you want to make it easier for Trump to change his views on Israel
Mm-hmm.
and to damp down the situation in West Asia, then here's one thing Biden can do that would be constructive. He could stop shipping arms to frickin' Israel.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that would create facts on the ground that Trump would have to cope with. And he'd have to cope with by recognizing those facts on the ground. And then his job would be to save Israel. But his job would not be to provide for greater Israel, because that would be impossible. And everybody would recognize it,
Mm-hmm.
including his donors. So I guess that's my thinking for today.
Yeah, that was a lot.
I have to say to everybody out there, I thought this presentation by the Schiller Institute was really, really great.
Mm-hmm.
It really should give everybody who's awake in the slightest bit something to think about. And the idea of looking for that third way, that is something we all have to do, and we all have to work to pressure first the Biden administration and then the Trump administration to try to think in terms of the third way. Because right now, we have two choices. One choice is just totally unacceptable. And the other choice, that is the capitulation choice, is also unacceptable for a lot of people. So people have to begin to think of a third way which benefits everybody. And Scott is very right to call for that. So, on that note, do you have anything else to comment on or to add?
No, I think you covered everything. I'm just going to take this day by day.
We got to take this day by day. I hope we can spread this particular stream around. We did have 40 people here for this stream, so it was a fair amount of people. But it was important enough, I think, that there should have been hundreds more to see this stream.
Or we'll just have to, share it around each day, keep reposting.
I think, keep reposting so people see it, because I think Scott's effort has to be supported, by all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And also people have to start thinking in terms of the other options that can exist, that can be beneficial to all sides if we want to pursue them. So on that note, Dee, I think I'm going to say good night.
Yes, and let's just also, uh, yeah, as you said earlier, please hit the like button, subscribe, and share. And also, Joe has a patreon.com account, Joe_Firestone. So if you can contribute to Joe, it will help him out a lot. It's a crazy economy we're living in.
Okay, thank you very much, Dee. I certainly greatly appreciate that.
Mhm.
I do need donations very badly. And so if people can afford it, I would, certainly appreciate those. And Dee needs donations badly too. And while she doesn't have a Patreon account, she does have a Cash App, I believe.
Yes, Cash App, Dolores Pierce.
Okay. And she needs some contributions too.
Yeah, we're all living in tough times.
We are living in tough times. And with what's being promised by the Trump administration right now, his flirtation, with Elon Musk involves perspectives of economic, what shall I call it? Uh, okay, to say it's idiocy is to understate the case, but the austerity they are planning for us all is completely unnecessary and completely stupid. And maybe if Trump reflects back on when he first came into office in 2017, and he made it known to people that he understood, that the United States could print as much money as it's needed to meet, its obligations. If he can go back to that kind of thinking, then we can work with him to show him why austerity, what Musk is talking about, and what Ramaswamy is talking about, is completely uncalled for, and um, um, unnecessary, and from his political point of view, unproductive. Because if he engages in that, he will totally lose congressional support by by 2027. He will lose Congress completely in January of 2027, and whatever else he wants to do will be frozen, and much of the things he thinks he accomplished uh, could be reversed, because what Musk and Ramaswamy want to do, to use an old expression, is going to create a depression that will curl Trump's hair.
Hmm. And that's what it was. The last time he was in office, he understood. That's what he had when he had the stimulus checks. And, some in his party were having a fit. He understood that if you put money into people's hands, they're going to spend it. And he knew it was important for the economy to do that.
He did know that at the time, and he did spend it, and that was good. And by the way, if Trump really thinks very carefully about that, I think he can understand that if he had forced Senator McConnell uh, uh, to allow a further round of stimulus checks, not of $600, but of $1,200, $1,400, or $2,000, that he would have been reelected. Okay,
Hmm.
the fall of 2020. He only, was not reelected because Mitch McConnell would not allow him to pass the stimulus checks he wanted to pass.
Exactly.
And Trump could have forced him to do it by simply declining to uh, 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 to nominate Amy Coney Barrett for the Supreme Court until he got his stimulus checks out of McConnell.
Exactly.
He had that leverage, and he didn't see it, and he didn't use it. So he didn't get his stimulus checks. In the end, he got a paltry 600, and it didn't affect, the election anyway, because it came too late.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure if he had gotten through a big stimulus check at that time, he would have won the election of 2020.
Most definitely.
So anyway,
Anyway, that's that. So hopefully he thinks about that.
hopefully he thinks about these things. Okay. However, I'm not too sure about what's going on with his own mental capabilities these days.
No, of course he's actually he's 4 years older, so
Right, and he didn't look like he was, thinking any too well during the campaign. I know he won, but I don't think that was because he was thinking so quick, so clearly. I think it was because people were sick, of what Biden was doing.
mm-hmm.
I think they were sick of Biden, and that's why Trump won.
Exactly. That's basically why he won.
It was the same reason why Biden won in 2020 when everybody was sick of Trump.
Exactly.
So I think Trump has to understand that he should not make people sick of him.
That's true.
Anyway, we could stay here all night, and we're at 2 hours and 57 minutes.
Okay, well, good night, Bonnie.
Good night.
Good night, Joe.
And thanks for coming on board with me tonight.
You're welcome. And good night, everyone.
Okay, good night, everyone. See you all soon.
Yes.
Okay. I got to end this stream. Here we go.